it's a great issue, not just for that assassination, but for future ones. Of anybody even thinking about assassinations, is that be careful of what you wish for, because you might end up getting something a lot worse.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor. And today we have Peter Stothard on the show, and that's who you heard at the start discussing the potential repercussions of any assassination. And we are discussing with him the assassination of Julius Caesar. Now, we're not confined to the assassination of Julius Caesar on our chat today. And we do mention the sort of looming, obvious presence of Vladimir Putin. And I know many people are thinking, well, wouldn't life be a lot easier if Putin was bumped off and then we could return to a sort of peaceful world? And the lesson that many assassinations in history, and certainly the assassination of Julius Caesar, gives is that you don't often get the end result that you hope for. So something to bear in mind. And Peter Stothard is an ideal person to talk about this with us. He's a classicist, so he's written this book, The Last Assassin, which is what we're talking about. That's all about the assassination of Caesar and then the hunt for the killers of Caesar, as they were all killed in sometimes rather brutal fashion. And he's also written other books that often combine politics with Roman history, and so I recommend you check them out. There's a very good one called The Senecans, Four Men and Margaret Thatcher. And coming up in part 2 next week, we talk a little bit more about his sort of political experience when there is another book he's written, and he spent a month with Tony Blair during the Iraq war planning. So we talk a little bit about that. We talk about Russians. That's coming up in part 2. There's a sort of Russian theme throughout our discussion of the assassination, and with the events going on in Ukraine, it's it's something that we have to address, really. Now, elsewhere on our website, we've got a great piece by Charles Spencer, who's written a book about the White Ship, called The White Ship. And the White Ship was a ship. Boat is the wrong terminology. A ship that was carrying the heir to the throne of England, Henry I's son, and it sank just outside the harbour of Harfleur. So I do recommend. It's on our homepage. You can't miss it. Elsewhere, we've got lots of book reviews on our website, so you can have a look through there. What we've got, our latest reviews, and you can also filter by a period of history you like if you want to look for a book or a subject that interests you. Right, moving on. Again, I've mentioned this before. We've got the unpublished novel competition. I'm boring you now, so I'll only be quick. £500 prize, and the book gets published, so I recommend that. If you want to get hold of me, you can either do it via email, history@aspectsofhistory.com, or you can get me on the Twitter. I'm at OllieWCQ. But I really hope you enjoy the show. It's a good chat with me and Peter Stothard, so I'll hand you over to me. Peter Stothard, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
Good to be here.
Right, so we're talking about your, we're having this discussion because this is going to go out. So listeners will be hearing this around about the Ides of March, the 15th of March. So that's why I wanted to talk to you. You've written a brilliant book, which I've just finished today, actually. The Last Assassin, and this is all about the assassins of Julius Caesar, but obviously it starts with the massive event, probably one of the greatest events, certainly of ancient history and of world history, which was the assassination of Julius Caesar. So I just thought it would help to start with, just to do a little bit of background for those listeners who probably aren't aware of Caesar's rise. They know he was a great figure, but why he became a target for the assassins, really?
There were a lot of
big
reasons.
Question, I know.
Well, there were a lot of reasons he became a target for the assassins, but the one thing that pulled them all together was that it was essentially political. He was killed by people who were really quite like him. He was killed by a lot of people who were his friends and who were certainly members of the same class as he was. And they were beginning to tolerate. They realized their system wasn't perfect, and that it was quite difficult to stop a strong man becoming stronger than everybody else and exercising too much power. So they weren't naive about that, but they feared in Caesar's case that he would make himself not only dictator for life after all his great successes in conquering places, obviously Gaul most of all, but that he might even start setting up a monarchy, that you wouldn't just have Caesar, but you might have Caesar's son and Caesar's grandson. And that, to a certain kind of Roman, was something that they thought they got rid of when they got rid of their kings many centuries before. There's all sort of faded mythology, really. We don't know much about the kings. We don't really know. But what we do know is that for the Romans of Caesar's time, the idea that someone might want to make themselves a king or anything like a king was a bit of a red line. And so they felt, or some of them did, that Caesar was getting far too close to that line, and that if they didn't get rid of him on the Ides of March, 44 BC, he was going to go off and do some conquering in the east this time instead of the west, and he would come back even stronger, and they would have missed their chance. And so the Ides of March was the moment where they had to go.
And the problem they had really was that Caesar was quite popular amongst the people in Rome, wasn't he? And certainly for his army, he was a popular commander.
Absolutely. And the assassins really got that very, very badly wrong. The assassins were sort of old. They were basically old aristocrats. I mean, Caesar was an aristocrat too, but the assassins were mostly of the old school, who talked a lot about liberty and how they wanted the traditional checks and balances, but to be honest, were pretty much on keeping their own power and keeping the power of their class. And the Caesar was particularly popular with the people of Rome, who he'd given a lot of money and free food and lots of lots of stuff that dictators learned to do to make people happy. He'd also, massively made Rome more powerful and more opportunities for looting and plundering and all the things that soldiers and people like and the people back home. So yeah, he was very popular, and also there was a lot of sort of radicals of one kind or another who were genuinely fed up with people like Brutus and Cassius and their mums and dads and their hereditary sort of system, and felt that they were, that Caesar was sort of on their side. And so, yeah, so when by the time the Ides of March was over, when the assassins thought that for various reasons they'd be frightfully popular, and because they got rid of the dictator who wanted to be king, they found that actually that wasn't the way that the ordinary people, and certainly not the way that the army saw it at all. So they were very naive and cut off in one respect.
Yeah, I mean, the very thing they were seeking to stop was the very thing that happened, in that his adoptive son starts a dynasty that lasted many years.
Yeah, that's a great issue, not just for that assassination, but for future ones. Of anybody even thinking about assassinations, is that be careful of what you wish for, because you might end up getting something a lot worse. And certainly the assassins of Julius Caesar, who did think a great deal. I'm not saying that they were trivial about it. I mean, they thought a great deal about whether they were justified in assassinating him, what would be the threshold for that justification. What were the principles on which it was okay to kill a dictator, and what were the principles on which it wasn't. They were thoughtful. They all would have called themselves philosophers of different kinds. So it wasn't that they didn't think about it. If anything, they sort of overthought it in terms for their own success, because the one thing they didn't do the opinion polling, as it were, that they didn't do. They did the political theory, but they didn't have a very clear idea of what what people thought or would think when they'd done it.
And your book's titled "The Last Assassin," and the last assassin being the last assassin who was killed, and that's Cassius Parmensis. Now, you've mentioned, many of them will view themselves as philosophers. Now, Cassius Parmensis, amongst some of the others, followed Epicurus. What was it about that philosophy that sort of helped push them to the assassination, or did it? What was the involvement of the Epicureans and their follower Epicurus and their followers in the assassination?
Well, in one very important sense, of course, it probably kept some of them back from killing, because one of the great principles of Epicurus was that you shouldn't really have anything to do with politics unless it was absolutely necessary. The aim of the Epicurean was to wall themselves off in a garden, look after their wives, their daughters, their slaves. They were very egalitarian within their garden, and not let the cares of the world and the troubles of the world concern themselves too much, on the basis that if they did that, they would get that perfect peace of mind, ataraxia they called it. And if you had got that perfect peace of mind, then you would have no fear of death. And it was fear of death that created all man's unhappinesses. These are very modern ideas. You can see hints of Freud. You can hear hints of all sorts of modern. So sometimes they sound a bit like sort of a hippie cult. So lots of modern resonances. So that's what the Epicureans were. But because they were also trained in philosophy, they realized that up to a certain point, this withdrawal wouldn't work. And so Gaius Cassius, the kinsman of Cassius Parmensis, who was the sort of like the number two amongst the assassins, and other Epicureans, came to the conclusion that actually, if someone was as bad as Caesar was going to be, or maybe already was, then you weren't entitled to stay in your garden and just cultivate your peace of mind. I mean, you can imagine sort of someone maybe thinking that. I mean, think about Putin now. I mean, how you might think in general, you shouldn't get involved. But if someone becomes so bad, and can you really have peace of mind when there are people like Julius Caesar or Vladimir Putin around? And this was a theoretical argument. At what point did your basic rules have to be abandoned for the sake of a higher rule, which was keeping your peace? No one could have peace of mind if Caesar was in charge. And so this was again quite a theoretical argument. And once they got to that point, then all the Epicurean thinkers realized, were able to be persuaded that actually in this particular case, but not in general, they should do the quite extraordinary thing of assassinating Julius Caesar.
Now, I wanted to mention Putin, and I'm glad you have first. So do you see echoes? Because you have Julius Caesar, he feels very secure. He's just won a civil war. He is feeling invincible. He's certainly first and foremost amongst the Romans. Vladimir Putin, I'm sure we're all rather hoping. So many commentators have been taken by surprise by this invasion of Ukraine, and many are thinking he's gone a bit mad. But do you see parallels between Julius Caesar in his secure position before he was knifed by his senators, as with Putin alone in the Kremlin?
Well, it's hard to resist the notion. I think all the pundits would sort of agree. I mean, whether this punditry is worth anything is another matter. But they do tend to say that if anybody moves out Putin, it'll be one of his friends or one of his close associates. It won't be another sort of people's revolution. I mean, I haven't heard a single person suggest that there's going to be a kind of storm, any kind of popular insurgency, a kind of storming of the Bastille, or the removal of the Tsar, or a kind of Lenin-like operation. I mean, who knows? But no, I haven't heard anybody suggest that.
It's looking unlikely, yeah.
Everyone, it says that if anything does happen, it will be, the defense minister or the interior minister or the head of the KGB or something like that. Now, we've got no idea whether that's true, but that was certainly, obviously, what had happened in Caesar's case. That the people who were most worried about him, were the people who, of course, knew him best. I mean, Caesar was killed by some people who were really quite sympathetic to him. I mean, they had not just fought with him through Gaul and through the Civil War. They liked him, they respected him, but also, of course, they knew his weaknesses. And you can imagine someone who perhaps would have been a very strong supporter of Putin, who said, look, yes, actually, you've done a lot of really good things, Vladimir, but I think you've now slightly lost it. And I think it'd be a good idea if somebody else took over. And you can imagine if for any reason, again, it's totally implausible. I don't think anyone suggested this, but if you thought that Vladimir Putin was not just dictator for life, which he does seem to have created himself unofficially, that position, no one seemed to think he's going anywhere for some while. If you thought that actually he wanted to hand over to one of his children, then that would be, then his friends and people, many of whom would actually quite like to succeed him, might feel, well, not only I don't have a decent job, or don't have as good a job as I'd like, or I'm not as rich as I'd like to be, while Vladimir's here, I'm not even going to get a chance afterwards because it's going to be somebody else and it's not going to be me. So it's not a clear parallel, but you can see that that's the way in which minds work when they're very close to a dictator. Everybody has got both something to like about him, otherwise they wouldn't be in the inner circle in the first place, and also something to really dislike about him, either because they're not rich enough, he's had an affair with their wife, he hasn't given them the land that they wanted, he's perhaps been too kind. One of Caesar's great problems for his supporters was that he was too generous to people who weren't his supporters. So they said things like, well, I've marched all over Gaul and put up with an awful lot of trouble for you, Julius Caesar. Well, it's that guy who's been sitting at home sort of vaguely cozying up to your enemy, it seems to have done just as well out of you as I have. So lots of turbulence within the inner circle. And we don't know whether there's any turbulence in the Putin inner circle or not. You might think that there probably would be at this point, but we've got no idea, of course.
And there are parallels, I suppose, with every political assassination. I mean, in the ancient world, you had, the sexual element is always quite significant. You've Philip II's assassination, and Harmodius and Aristogeiton and Hipparchus. There's always a sexual element, isn't there?
Well, there certainly can be, and there was a little bit in the case of Caesar too. Servius Sulpicius Galba, who was one of the assassins, he was not at all pleased that Caesar had been carrying on with his wife, and he might have joined the group anyway. But that certainly didn't help. But and the Greeks did rather amplify and obviously exaggerate, particularly the Athenians, their role as sort of tyrant killers. So Harmodius and Aristogeiton were people who killed the Pisistrated tyrant, and there was great statues of them in Athens. And indeed, when Brutus, once he realized that he wasn't very popular in Italy, and Brutus and Cassius had to go to Greece, and they ended up fighting a massive battle at Philippi. Brutus went to Athens, and he was hailed as a sort of modern day, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, and they put up a big statue to him. I mean, that's how the Greeks liked to see them. The Athenians liked to see them as these sort of tyrant killers. So they were particularly keen on Brutus for that reason. It didn't do Brutus much good, but they were keen on him. Anyway, the way that Berezovsky saw himself as under threat, and of course he used another bit of the kind of Russian historical mythology, which is the sort of Stalin's pursuit of Lenin. Who Lenin escaped and was eventually killed with an ice pick in
Trotsky.
Mexico. Trotsky. Sorry. So he saw himself as a bit of a Trotsky. I mean, he felt under that he was pursued. And to be honest, at that time, I thought he was a bit paranoid. I mean, he may have been paranoid. I just, it's very hard to work out what was really going on. However, when we were talking away, and he mentioned this guy Cassius Parmensis, who I have to say I had never heard of. In fact, hardly anybody has ever heard of him. I mean, nobody until I did this book. I don't think anybody had really thought much about Cassius Parmensis. He's the least known of all the conspirators against Julius Caesar. And he was only important to Berezovsky was because he identified with this guy who felt that the big bad guys from back home were after him. And I was a bit embarrassed, to be honest, because I was, in a way, was the kind of classicist and editor of the Times supposed to know about this stuff. And he was a sort of oligarch engineer and mathematician. And so there's virtually only when I got home that I kind of, it was very difficult to find anything about Cassius Parmensis. I mean, he doesn't appear in any, much in any of the books. I mean, you can look at a biography of Caesar and not find it. Doesn't even appear in the index. So yes, it was if it hadn't been for Boris Berezovsky, I might not have done this journey. Unfortunately, Boris Berezovsky's prescience didn't really help him in the wider world because he was eventually found hanged in his bathroom in circumstances which nobody could really explain at the time.
No, I don't know if the police are going back to that one because they're going back to some of the other killings or deaths. Who knows what?
I don't know. I think there's probably quite a few. I mean, he if you remember, Boris had just lost a big lawsuit against Roman Abramovich, and was not. I think when multi-billionaires are down to their last billion, they start feeling a bit unhappy and poor. I mean, I think he was probably not feeling as quite as chipper as he had been before. He may well have killed himself. But on the other hand, that was before Salisbury and before a lot of those we know. We just don't know.
Indeed. Now, Cassius Parmensis it's interesting that you use him as the sort of main character because he does seem sort of a little bit. I doubt he's not one of the first assassins to stick the knife in, but he's just sort of but he's slightly so from that respect he seems slightly detached, but he's certainly he goes down fighting all the way really until there's no more fighting left and he return and then goes to Athens, doesn't he? I
mean, that's the important thing about him, which is true, which is interesting for all assassins and all assassinations, is that who really of a group of assassins ever gets to find out what the effect of an assassination is? Because Brutus and Cassius, the main architects of the assassination, died at Philippi. So so they only saw about a couple of years of the effect, and they didn't really. They died for most of their lives still thinking that they might have succeeded, and they lost the battle and they killed themselves. But so they didn't realize the actual result of their assassination would be that they would get the very hereditary empire of the Caesars that they've been trying to stop. Whereas Parmensis, although much less important at the time, ended up sort of fighting for pretty well every cause apart from the winning one in the wars that followed. But he also he lived he lived to sort of 31. He lived for 13 years. So he was the only assassin who saw the full impact of what they've done, which I think is important, because it's that whole question of be careful of what you wish for, and the difference between intentions and outcomes. He was the one who got the best view of the outcome of an assassination, which was that on the whole assassinations don't do very well. That's not a good move.
And it was he's an interesting character, isn't he? I mean, he was a pretty good naval commander and playwright.
Well, we have to, a lot of this is we have to work our way through the rather small amount of evidence about this. But he lived in a time. He lived in Parma. A lot of people know Parma. So now Parma ham and Parmesan cheese, and even in those days, it was a very fertile area, quite wealthy. It wasn't actually in Italy; it was just outside Italy, because on the way the borders were there. So they were kind of independent. They were very pro Caesar. Caesar had, as it were, given the land around Parma to lots of his own veterans. So they were solid military stock who Caesar had looked after really well, and who were pro Caesar. And you might think of them rather slightly provincial, probably by the standards of the Romans. But that didn't stop them thinking of themselves as a bit of a philosopher, a bit of a poet, a bit of a playwright, because that's what the sort of civilized Roman of those days did. It wasn't that they were kind of artists set apart. That was what it meant to be a kind of Roman. I mean, even Julius Caesar and Cicero, and almost all the big players, Brutus, all thought of themselves as philosophers and poets at one time or another. That was just what people were. But I think we can reckon that Parmensis was a bit more serious than that, because Horace refers to him, and so he did have an actual style. And yes, you're right. He was an artist, gentleman farmer, you might like to think, who, when it came to actually being a soldier, was really a sailor rather than a soldier, and he played a big role in a lot of battles which no one even thinks about now. I mean, no one even writes about them. I mean, many people said when I did this book, professional classicists and everybody, is that most books end with the assassination of Caesar. That's the end of the Republic, and they tend to, people's minds tend to sort of get going again after the Battle of Actium, in Antony and Cleopatra.
But Actium's such a damp squib, isn't it, as a battle?
Yeah, it wasn't much of a battle, but history, as you well know, has to choose dates. It has to choose boundaries and dates, and historians argue about where the boundaries are. But in this particular case, a lot of people start their thinking and their writing with the Battle of Actium and the beginning of the empire, and they end it at the death of Julius Caesar and the end of the Republic. Well, my book describes a very dramatic period, when Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, was hunting down every single one of the people who he thought had killed his father, who had killed his father, and was having to fight off enemies on his own side. Obviously, most obviously Mark Antony, but also Sextus Pompeius too. Now, Mark Antony is still famous because Shakespeare wrote a play about him. Sextus Pompeius isn't really famous at all because he wasn't so lucky. He got a bit part. But at the time, these were all people who might have done just as well as the Emperor Augustus did. And Cassius Parmensis ended up fighting for all of them, apart from the guy who actually won.
And Cicero, the great orator who you've mentioned, he wasn't included in the assassination by the other by Cassius or Brutus, and he was a great enthusiast of the assassination afterwards. I just wonder if that's because it was successful, but why didn't they include him beforehand, do you think?
Well, Cicero was an intellectual and a sort of deal maker, and I don't think they would have trusted. Cicero would have talked a lot. he would have got himself involved in those arguments I was talking about earlier as to exactly when you were justified in assassinating Caesar or not. But he was probably, from the point of view of the leaders, perhaps too good an arguer. So that what they didn't want was someone who's going to argue them out of their own position, and they just didn't trust him. They thought he would. I mean, secrecy was obviously tremendously important. It's amazing in a way that the secrecy was maintained. We don't know how many people were involved in the plot. Could have been 30, 40. We haven't got a clue. But it was very public, and the whole point about this assassination was that it had to be public. I mean, if you'd really just wanted to get rid of Caesar, it'd be more like a modern kind of assassination where you send a secret agent to poison him in a back alley. But the assassins, that wouldn't have worked for the assassins. They wanted it to be public. They wanted it to be clear that that Caesar was repudiated in Parliament, in the Senate, by his own people, so that everybody would have a story that showed how justified this was. And I think with Cicero, they probably thought that that was just one risk too many in terms of Cicero, in terms of Caesar finding out what was going to happen.
Now, in the wake of the assassination, there's this sort of scrawny teenager who's in Greece on his studies, and it's extraordinary, really, that he returns and sort of transforms into this. Well, he certainly knows what he wants to do, doesn't he? I'm talking about Octavian here.
Yes, and nobody took him seriously. Mark Antony, who was Caesar's sort of mucker and who'd been with Caesar throughout Gaul and was sort of definitely thought that once Caesar was gone, he would be the one who would sort of take over, perhaps be a bit nicer than Caesar, been to a slightly different kind of people, would be able to do a few deals, and he would be the big cheese, and he would inherit all Caesar's party and Caesar's popularity, and that would all be great. But when he heard that Caesar had actually made a will and had left his titles and his resources to an 18-year-old boy who was on a sort of gap year in Athens, whose mum and dad were not that keen. The last thing they wanted was, they thought, we'd already seen what happened to one Caesar. We're not going to let little Octavian go back and get a dagger from another dagger from Mark Antony or some of his mates. So I don't think he got a great deal of encouragement, but he was determined that he was going to have his get what he would inherited, or at least get the money anyway. So he comes back, and I think he was just overwhelmed by the power of the Caesar name.
Is it landing in Brundisium? Is that? Yeah, do you think that's when? In
Brundisium, and he very quickly realized that he had inherited. He had inherited money and things, but actually, what he'd really inherited, that he was now Caesar, and and the people who were really calling the shots, or you certainly had to do business with, were Caesar's armies and the people in the streets of Rome, and a lot of them, any Caesar would do. And he wasn't a particularly charismatic speaker. He wasn't very physically very prepossessing. When it came to the big battles, he tended to sort of sit them out. He was not very well. I mean, he had many things that weren't going for him. But what he did have, and what his enemies never quite realized until it was too late, was the fact that his soldiers and the people thought that they were doing what they were doing for Caesar. And I think once Octavian came back and realized that he had this absolutely priceless asset, he's an extremely intelligent boy, became an extremely intelligent man. And he realized that this was something he really could do things with. And then everything ran on from there. But it was probably a shock to himself, I expect. It certainly was a shock to everybody else. Everybody else who nobody was talking to. I mean, nobody ever talked to the soldiers. We've got no records of them. Nobody ever talked to the people. No records of them. All the clever, smart people had a view of what should happen and what would happen, which was totally different from what did happen, and why.
Now, Mark Antony, who was not involved. Obviously, he was a close ally of Caesar's, but he in the way in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, he sort of tries to play a kind of pragmatic line, which Octavian's return sort of disrupts, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, he takes the view, which is not necessarily a bad view, if Octavian hadn't done what he did and been who he was, which is that you had, in fact, he worked with Cicero to walk a very fine line. They wanted to get rid of the idea that there'd be a hereditary dictator, but they wanted everybody who had been promised jobs by Caesar and had promised money and promised advancement to get them. So he thought that you could sort of say that in one sense Caesar was legitimate. Otherwise, all the jobs that he promised you would be illegitimate. So he wanted that to be legitimate in one way and illegitimate in another way, in the sense that he wanted to be a hereditary tyrant. And I think it was really more Cicero working with Mark Antony that managed to produce a formula, rather, sort of tricky formula that was able to sort of stay on that line, which kept everybody happy. Everybody got the jobs they wanted, and they got rid of Caesar. And that probably would have worked if it hadn't been that Octavian came along and knocked it off. Because as soon as Octavian came back and started saying he wanted vengeance against the assassins, then Antony, who previously had been for forgiving the assassins, really having an amnesty, was dragged, as often happens in politics. If you've got someone, as it were, kind of competing against, if you're a left winger and you've got someone competing against you from the left, then you've got to move your position leftwards in order to win the primary or win the early election. Then you have to tap back to the centre in order to rule the government. Well, Antony was dragged towards the path of vengeance so that he and Octavian could be together and satisfy Caesar's soldiers. And it was only when they'd won against the assassins, and some 50,000 people died, and the cream of Roman society at Philippi. An extraordinary event. Only when they'd done that did they then fall out amongst themselves. And then there was a sort of another 10 years of war in which Cassius Parmensis played a part to see who would actually end up top dog.
So that's the end of part one. Coming up in part two, out next week, we go over a little bit more Roman history, and we also deal with Russians, Putin, and the situation with the Kremlin. And then we also cover other political leaders, in particular Tony Blair, because Peter, as I mentioned at the start, has actually one-on-one and direct experience of Tony Blair during the difficult days of the Iraq War. And so it's discussing assassination, Tony Blair, and Peter Stothard, who was, one thing I didn't mention at the start, he was editor of the Times for 10 years. So, this is an area that he has a really good knowledge of, and he's obviously thought about it a lot. So I really enjoyed talking with him. Before I go, if you can give me a review or subscribe, I would be hugely grateful. And until part two, thank you and good night.